AM 1460, the new WXBR. You were listening to the Metro South Morning Show. Peter Zimborn, Mike Pava here with you on this Tuesday morning. And as has been the case all week and will continue to be the case, we're going to be chatting with all of the City Council-At-Large candidates in Brockton that agree to speak with us during the 7 o'clock hour throughout the duration of the week. And joining us in studio right now is an incumbent who is seeking re-election for Brockton City Council-At-Large, Mr. Jass Stewart. Jass, good morning and welcome to the program.
It's great to be here.
Jass, tell us what the experience for you has been like being a city council at large for Brockton, because you initially made a name for yourself as a guy who came out of nowhere and ran for mayor 2 times consecutively and came within a few hairs of dethroning an incumbent both times.
Right. So being on the city council, I think, has been just an incredible experience. I've learned a lot. I think I've been able to contribute a lot over my last 2 terms, making some real significant changes, some of that big, heavy lifting stuff that people typically say is impossible to do in terms of making change, and I'm proud to say that I've been successful at moving that needle in terms of reform in city government. So I've always stayed focused on who got me elected, and I always remember essentially where I come from, and I've put all that kind of energy into the work that I do on the council.
I know it meant a lot to you, those 2 races where you were opposing Jim Harrington in your bid for the mayoral seat in Brockton. In retrospect, is it better to have served as a city councilor at large to try to vie for that position later, or would you still would have liked to have been mayor of Brockton a few years back?
That's a very good question. I think if I were mayor of Brockton several years ago, that some of the things that we are facing, I think, would have been different. But there's a lot of influence and potential in that particular position, and we'll see what the future holds. But again, as I mentioned, I think I've been able to put forward a really progressive agenda that speaks to the needs of residents as a city councilor, and gotten some really important initiatives through.
It's interesting, when you run for office, when you're not the incumbent, you can say, this is what I'm going to do. When you seek re-election as someone in a particular seat, you can say, this is what I'm going to do, but you also just have to say, this is what I've done. What position do you like being in? You've been in both.
Right. Oh, definitely. It's more powerful to be in a position where you say, this is what I've accomplished. You know, Henry Ford said that you don't build a reputation on what you're going to do, but on what you've accomplished. I think it may depend on if you've been successful or not. You know, if I've been a city councilor for 2 terms and didn't have much to look to, maybe I would prefer the position of things I like to commit to in the future. But, you know, I'm the person who was the first to oppose the power plant against some very powerful interests in the city, and I stood alone for several months before others.
You're not the only one to claim that, by the way.
Oh, no, most people say I was one of the first.
Okay.
I am the first, and I take that on very seriously, because it was a very risky move to make in terms of political moves, but it was certainly the right move to make in terms of the interest of residents. I'd say that my work on nepotism and pushing through the city's first anti-nepotism policy. So we have a system in place where every single resident has a fair shot at a city job. It was something, as you probably remember, was a very long, drawn-out, year-long process to get it through the city council and to get the administration to buy into this new, way of doing business. And it was tough, and I did it. Another thing that was really controversial was the DJ Henry episode. That teenager who lived in Easton, grandparents lived in Brockton, was in New York, was shot, and I pushed through a resolve to formally request the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, to look at this case to ensure that there was justice. And that became controversial, but I felt that was so important to make certain that as an elected official, we're standing up for our residents and families in need, particularly when something is at the least suspect, and that we wanted to make certain that that family received the full force of an honest look at that case. And as we later discovered, there were some issues with the case that were not fair, and so I'm happy to stand kind of ahead of the pack when it comes to taking on some of these important issues.
You mentioned the power plant. Why do you oppose the power plant?
I mean, it's really multi-layered. I mean, clearly, when you're looking at health issues, I don't think anyone is saying that the power plant is pollutant-free. Some will argue that it's cleaner than burning diesel, but burning natural gas is a pollutant. All you have to do is look at the size of the stack, and the reason that the stack is so high is because the way the industry is structured, the more pollutants, the higher you place the stack to remove it, from the population below. So the idea that it's not would not cause additional pollution in the city, I don't think anyone argues that is the case. So there's pollutant issues. I also just never was a fan of how that deal was put together. You had very powerful people in the city, former elected officials, who I believe used the power of their past position to position themselves into a place where they would make millions of dollars off a deal while the residents would be stuck with a bad industry. I'm being careful what I say because I'm being sued personally by the power plant proponents as well as the city. So because we're in litigation, I can't talk a lot about it. But I would say it's just not the right industry. It's in the wrong location, and the deal at worst was nefarious, and at best just very suspect. And I don't think that's how we should do business in the city.
Jace, I just want to stick with the power plant just for another second. Yeah. A while back, you were criticized by your constituents for trying to at least meet with these people to get some sort of plan B, where if something does happen and this plant does get through, we have some sort of backup plan in place. Where did that go as far as being criticized by your constituents, and is there any backup plan in place now?
So to clarify, I didn't meet with the power plant folks. I went and met with our team of Brockton residents who were in opposition. So we would hold regular strategy meetings on what was being litigated, what our next moves would be. And I think you're right. What became clear to me was these folks were not going away. They, at that time, had spent about $25 million, and the city had spent roughly $700,000. And so they had already made the big investment to get this plant here. And when the conversation around the power plant proponents using the desal water instead of the sewer plant water, if you may remember, they wanted to buy the sewer plant water for $300,000. And everyone thought that was a great deal because we paid to dispose of that water. But they were also willing and able to spend $3 million for the desal water, which meant that the sewer water was worth $3 million and not $300,000. So it became clear to me that they were not honest brokers and that we had no clue what the value of this project was. And as we go through these various court cases, it was unclear, certainly from those on the opposition side, at what point do we lose our leverage? And so my point was, let's figure out what this project is worth. Let's figure out what court cases put us in a position of having less influence on a final deal if that needed to be the case. And let's just be smart about it. Not to suggest that we had to or we should try to mitigate, but let's just have the facts in front of us and be smart about it. And that went public, unfortunately, from someone internally, which I don't think helped the case because the goal wasn't to let the other side know what you were thinking.
Now, you mentioned the Aquaria desal plant moments ago. It seems to be the case that it's almost unanimous among city officials that they don't like the deal that's in place right now between Brockton and the plant. The question is whether or not can the agreement that the city has with the desal plant be broken? Was there a breach of contract from the plant somewhere that allows the city to break that contract? Do you like the deal the city has with them? And if not, do you think that's a deal that the city of Brockton can get out of?
Well, the city solicitor has already looked at that contract multiple times. As from my understanding, there hasn't been a level of a breach of that agreement that we can modify it. I would like to continue to put pressure on the Aquaria owners to do more around marketing the plant, which is what I think is sort of the weakest point in that contract, where if there were an out, that could be the out. I think that contract has gotten a lot of criticism. I do, and it's a very muddy past about how that came to be, and that was well before I got on the city council and my colleagues. But I do know that the state mandated a solution to our water crisis. As you may remember, several years ago, particularly in the 90s, Brockton couldn't develop. The rest of the country was going through this big boom in the 90s, if you may remember. We were under a water moratorium, so we couldn't hook up additional businesses or homes in the city to water supply. And so a lot of the businesses that may have come to Brockton at that time, frankly, drove right past Brockton because they couldn't get the water sewer hookup that they needed. And so the state, and so it hurt us economically. And so a solution needed to be found. The state mandated that there was a consent decree, and the state mandated we find an alternate water source for the city. They also mandated the level of the volume of water we needed as for that source. And my understanding is the city lobbied to have that volume lowered, that the state was mandating way too much than what we needed. But the state, I'm not privy to those exact conversations, but clearly we were stuck with a situation that was mandated by the state. Now we have way too much water that we don't need, partly because of the fact that there's been a lot more rain than anyone ever anticipated that we would have in the area. So it was almost just a culmination of lots of bad circumstances that came together to make this a really terrible deal for the city. So yes, it's a bad deal. I don't think necessarily it was a deal that was structured in a way where people did not put thought into it, and that we were, and that no one can project the future. But so how do we get out of it at the moment? We've looked at it from some different angles. I just think that, again, my goal is to make certain that the Aquaria folks live up to their side of the contract, and where they seem to be the weakest is on the marketing side.
Let's step away from the power plant and talk about renewable energy or green energy, which is really a hot topic, especially just really the buzzword around the nation at this point. Brockton's bright fields are very successful. Is there anything on the horizon besides a coal-fired power plant or something that could be more renewable and greener for Brockton?
Right, and keep in mind that the kinds of energy you get from a bright field is fairly insignificant for the kind of electricity you would get from a power plant. So I'm not suggesting that a bright field in the place of where the power plant is a viable solution economically for anyone. I'm suggesting that I'm not an opponent of burning gas for fuel, for power, because it's the most efficient form at the kind of levels that you need, the volumes that you need. I am opposed to burning gas in the middle of a city. And that plant should be located someplace out in the woods where it's not impacting the lives of people. So I'm a pretty practical, reasonable person, and I know that we need power. We're using power right now, and that power has to be generated somewhere. But in terms of renewable energy, one project that I focused on with DPW, and we were not awarded the grant. I forget the details here, but there's been some state movement around the digestive systems, where you take organic waste, you put the waste in a tank, and then the bacteria then creates gas. That gas is then used to create power. And I had worked with a scientist from MIT to kind of do a quick assessment of what that would look like in terms of power generation in Brockton. So if you took all of the organic waste that's tossed in the trash in Brockton, and I forget the details exactly, but it became clear that we could power in this city just through our organic waste, not including the waste from restaurants, the oils and things like that, just from home waste. Every single building in Brockton, and I believe he said about a third of the city in terms of residential homes, could be powered through the use of creating energy from organic waste, which is clean energy. So it's not burning waste. It's this digestive system. So the state is pushing some communities to go in that direction to test it. I think there's great potential for Brockton there, and we'll see what happens.
Once again, we're chatting with Jass Stewart here on AM 1460, the new WXBR, seeking re-election for the Brockton City Council-At-Large seat in the general election on November the 5th. Earlier, we were talking about the power plant, and I don't want to keep harping on the power plant.
Yes, you do.
No, not necessarily. This will be the last question, Jace. You mentioned that you feel that there are people in former positions of power in Brockton who have used their former position to influence a situation which they can benefit millions of dollars from. Can you elaborate on that at all?
Well, it's not. I think everyone understands that this power plant just didn't come to Brockton from outer space. I mean, that Brockton Power is formed by a group of Brockton residents and former Brockton residents and political interest. So the purpose of Brockton Power LLC was to construct the necessary environment to bring this project to the city. I mean, yes, we do have the power lines, we have the potential water, and we have the gas line here. And so those three sources make it an ideal location for a power plant. But we went out, when I say we, there were individuals in the city that went out and solicited this project to bring it here. I don't think Siemens scanned the universe and somehow just landed in Brockton without our invitation. So I just don't think that's how we should be doing business, where a few people, like I said, make millions of dollars and the rest of us get holding the bag with really bad air and bad water.
But you don't want to mention who those people are?
I think most people know who those folks are.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're listening to AM 1460, the new WXBR. We're chatting with Jass Stewart here on this Tuesday morning. Let's talk about public safety. You are a city councilor at large right now, and as you know, has been the case in recent months, Brockton has been receiving a lot of negative attention and publicity due to the fact that there's been some pretty gruesome stuff happening in the city in relation to murders and whatnot. What can be done to curb this?
Well, I mean, that's a tough nut to crack. I mean, I think I've always said that we need to put a lot more money into economic development and planning, even if that means a little bit less money into police enforcement, because unless we get our economic house in order and we're able to bring in businesses, which then brings in, and the kind of development that brings in a middle class, folks who have disposable income, we're not going to create the kind of demand that will generate the turnaround that we're all looking for. And it's sort of like you're going to constantly end up chasing your tail, if you don't put the right investments up front to bring in the kinds of businesses and the middle class families we need in the city. So that's one approach I would push for, more money in economic development to set the stage for the right kind of economic growth in the city. I think we have to do a lot more to make certain that these young people who are creating these situations in the city have as many opportunities as possible to lead a different kind of life. Now, when I was first elected to the city council, I met with some of the gang leaders. I didn't highly publicize it, but I will say, and I had a meeting with the mayor about my conversations with the DA and with the police chief at the time, and essentially two of the gang leaders, and they were pretty prominent parts of the gang community, how you want to describe it, but essentially they wrote a letter to me and said we would be very interested in trying to do things differently in the city, particularly around settling differences with the use of firearms. If we could, and they wanted something in return, and what they wanted in return really was a place to go in the city to do their music, take their creative talents and try to commercialize it and things like that. That was just a very strong indication to me that there were young people who had these untraditional resumes. I mean, they're very smart, savvy, entrepreneurial people. They're in the wrong line of business without question. But also they couldn't take those talents and go into a more traditional career path. And many of them, I think, wanted to, but felt stuck because of their past history. And so I think the city could benefit greatly from creating a space where young people who have these untraditional resumes can take their talents and get into a more mainstream way of life. And then lastly, I think you just want to, frankly, force out of your city all those bad characters as much as possible. So the work that we're doing around targeting the small number of people who are committing a majority of the crime in the city, focusing on those hot spots, those places where a lot of this crime is taking place. I mean, I don't think you want to be soft on crime. You want to crack down and push out of the city any person who feels like they can't respect the rule of law and drive them out of the city. So I think if you do all those things, you could lead to a much safer city that also spurs economic development. So one is more money on economic development. Two, making certain you have more opportunities for young kids to change their career path. And three, be very aggressive in law enforcement by targeting those who are committing most of the crime.
Last month, the City Council approved, by request by Mayor Linda Balzotti, that $3.6 million was to be taken out of the stabilization fund to be used to pay for the firefighters' contract. You were the one no vote. Why was that?
It seemed like, and I think people who work hard and for a living, and certainly our firefighters, do a great job in the city and earn their pay. So I'm not the kind of person who would suggest that no one is deserving of a raise. But that has to be all placed in context on how much money you have available to pay those raises.
Was it more of a vote no against where the money was coming from as to where the money was going?
Right. It was a vote that we just don't have the money. Mm-hmm. So if you have, with this contract and with this agreement in place, we're basically depleting the stabilization fund to around $2 million. If the police union accepts a similar contract, which is typically how it's done, they look at previous contracts and then you negotiate around that precedent. My understanding is with the police patrolmen's union, with a similar contract, it would take the stabilization fund down to $0. Mm-hmm. It takes about 5 to 6 years to invest in the fund and bring it up to the levels that it was. And I don't even know how you then deal with future contracts, beyond this point, or other emergencies beyond this point. I mean, for example, the city can deficit spend when it comes to plowing the roads. But why should we go and borrow money to plow the roads when we had the money in place? My suggestion would have been that the firefighters union and the city go back and renegotiate that agreement that's more reasonable based on the financial situation of the city. It just seemed very reasonable to me. I thought it was one of the most irresponsible votes that I've seen the city council take in my tenure as a city councilor.
Well, Jace, I want to thank you so much for coming on the program this morning. Any final words for our listeners this morning before we let you go? Now is your time.
Well, I would say that it's been an honor and a pleasure to serve the residents of Brockton. I go to a lot of functions and
a lot.
And the reason I do, frankly, is because I really enjoy seeing the people there. And it's just a constant reminder of why I'm in this job and why it's such a great city. Just the potential and the energy and the promise in those rooms where folks are gathered basically to kind of find their own happiness and figure out for themselves how they want to build a future for their families and create a better city. It's all happening in these different functions, and just proud to be a part of that mix and that people have trusted me to represent their interest. And I go to work every day, and every single vote I think about the fact that I'm working for the residents of the city, and that's really the only calling that I have as a city councilor, is to represent the best interest. It doesn't mean that people always agree with my decisions, and oftentimes they do not. But I've never made a vote where I didn't think it was the best interest of the city as a whole. And I want to continue that work, and I'm hoping that people will put me back in office on November 5th.
One final question before we let you go. You've run for mayor before. You've run for state rep. You're currently a city councilor-at-large. What are your ultimate ambitions in the world of government?
I think there's no secret that my dream job, if that were to happen, would be the mayor of the city. Now, is that in the foreseeable future? I don't know. It's a great undertaking to move in that direction personally, financially, emotionally, physically. But I think there's a lot of influence that a mayor can make in changing the direction of a city. That one single role is really, really influential. And some of the things that I've done as a city councilor that have taken years to do could certainly be done in weeks if I were the mayor. So that's where I see myself at some point, and we'll see what the future brings.
I thought he was going to say president for a second. I'm not going to lie.
No way. But they grade too fast.
That is Jass Stewart, candidate for Brockton City Council-at-Large, joining us here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. You're listening to the Metro South Morning Show, PM in the AM. We'll step aside for a quick break. Back with more after this.